What's up, how you doing? When I was a kid, I would hang around with my good friend Stivoletti and my other two good friends, the Alanado brothers, Ricky and Scarborough. And we didn't hang around near the house like kids do nowadays because their parents are afraid they're going to get kidnapped. We looked at kidnapping as an adventure, so we hung around far away. Nobody knew where we were. We didn't have any cell phones. We wouldn't have carried them even if we had them in those days. But anyway, so we used to walk everywhere because we didn't know how to ride a bike. But eventually when we learned how to ride a bike, I ended up getting a Huffy, and they ended up getting whatever brand they got. My Huffy vanished, and their bikes vanished. And then I bought a scooter. It was a blue-green color, and then they bought their scooters, which were red. So my scooter ended up disappearing eventually, and their scooters ended up disappearing eventually. And over time we realized we have a neighborhood thief, but we didn't know who it was. Then as the years passed, we used to buy things, toys, whatever, and one by one they would disappear. It's like magic. Across the street we had a woman. Diagonally across the street from us there was a woman, and her name was MCconky, and I know I've mentioned her before. And she lived in that house since the 1920s. A little bit, you know, weird. And I remember one time my parents were away, and this was during high school, and I was home, and it was kind of like summertime, and we had a massive thunderstorm, lightning and all that stuff going on, and I went to sleep, and somewhere in the middle of the night there was a loud, you know, thunderbolt and lightning flash, and all of a sudden, in reverse order, but all of a sudden I got up, couldn't sleep, and I remember I pushed the shade back and looked outside, and it was dark, it was raining hard, and then all of a sudden the lightning hit and the whole place lit up. And we had an old tree in the backyard that my mother used to put the clothesline on, and I look, and there was somebody back there, and I see MCconky was back there looking at me while I'm looking at her. I'm thinking, what is she doing in my backyard in the middle of the night while it's raining? And she was wet. But anyway, I went back to sleep hoping that she would vanish and not try and set the house on fire. But had like a weird relationship with MCconky. A couple of times when I was a little kid I ran into her because she was always walking everywhere. I would be in the station wagon driving around with my parents, and I would look out the window and MCconky would be walking somewhere. I would be riding my bike when I had a bike, and MCconky would be walking somewhere. So she was a walker. But when we had incidences in my neighborhood, like for instance, there was a intersection that every month or so there was an accident. It was always like some kind of collision going on there, and I'd be in the backyard and I'd hear the crash, and we'd all go running to see what had happened, and the whole neighborhood would gather around in those four corners. MCconky always had her camera, and she would take pictures, and she had one of these cameras. It's a Kodak Instamatic 104, but this is the exact copy of the camera right here. So she was always snapping pictures left, right, you know. One time a water main broke underneath our street, and we had a geyser going on there for a couple hours, and MCconky was there along with the rest of the neighborhood, and she was snapping pictures. So time went on, and MCconky disappeared. Nobody knew where she had gone. Did she die? Did she get kidnapped? Nobody knew. So a few years went by, and one day I'm in my room and I look out the window and I notice a light on and a face at the window, and I see MCconky there, a little bit older, same hairstyle, looking at me. I'm looking at her. We made the eye contact thing, and I go, that's strange, where'd she come from? About a week after that, MCconky had died. And I remember that because she was in the house so long, I guess she outlived her relatives. There was nobody to go and claim her. So the police had to go and bust down the door. They removed her, and then they made a discovery. In the basement there were tons and tons and tons of things. My bike, my friend's bike, my other friend's bikes, my scooter, my toys throughout the years, all of them, every single one of them in her basement. Apparently MCconky was the neighborhood thief, and they found a stash of pictures, thousands of pictures, analog pictures where you need to develop the film, those kind of pictures taken with this kind of camera, in her basement in a big hefty bag. And it was all pictures, like a history of my neighborhood. Anytime there was any kind of situation that had gone down, she was there. She was like the photographer of the neighborhood. And I was in a ton of those pictures. From the time I was this big all the way until I was about that big, she had pictures of me in her bag, including my friends, but there was a lot of pictures of me in there. So anyway, that's what happened. And I'm sure a lot of people have a Mrs. McConky in their neighborhood, but we had a Mrs. McConky with a camera, and she liked to take things. So that's what happened.